The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Creek, its rays turning the wooden buildings into furnaces and the dirt streets into choking clouds of dust. It was the kind of heat that made decent folk seek shade and brought out the worst in those who had little decency left to begin with. Sarah McKenna clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from fear. The 23-year-old schoolteacher had made a terrible mistake coming to this part of town alone, but desperation had clouded her judgment. Her younger brother Tommy lay fevered and sick back at their small homestead, and Dr. Patterson had demanded payment up front for the medicine that could save the boy's life. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the cruel laughter surrounding her. "I'll have the money by week's end. I swear it on my father's grave." The 5 men who had cornered her behind Miller's general store seemed to find her desperation amusing. Buck Morrison, the town's self-appointed enforcer, spat tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. His weathered face bore the permanent sneer of a man who'd never known kindness and took pleasure in its absence. "Week's end?" Buck's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "Well now, missy, that medicine ain't gonna wait a week, and neither are we." His companions, rough men who drifted between odd jobs and petty crime, chuckled at his words. Sarah's knees trembled as she remained crouched in the dirt, her simple brown dress already stained with dust and despair. The men had taken her small purse, containing the few coins she'd managed to scrape together, and now they wanted more. They always wanted more. "My brother is dying," she pleaded, tears cutting clean tracks down her dirt-stained cheeks. "He's only 12 years old. Please, just let me go home to him." "That's real touching," sneered Jake Henley, a thin man with yellowed teeth and breath that reeked of cheap whiskey. "But you came to us, remember, asking for a loan. Well, we got terms for pretty little things like you." But the implication hung in the air like the oppressive heat, and Sarah felt her heart race with terror. She'd heard the stories whispered among the other women in town, stories of what happened to those who couldn't pay their debts to Buck Morrison and his gang. "I won't," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying a strength that surprised even her. "I'd rather die first." Buck's laugh was harsh and ugly. "That can be arranged too, sweetheart, but it'd be a waste of something so valuable." The sun continued its relentless assault on the town, casting long shadows from the buildings. In the distance, Sarah could hear the normal sounds of Copper Creek: horses' hooves on dirt, the creak of wagon wheels, voices calling out in the main street. Life continuing as normal, while her world crumbled in this forgotten alley. As Buck reached down toward her, Sarah closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle she didn't believe would come. The shadow fell across Sarah before any of them heard a sound. It started as just a shift in the light, a darkness that seemed to pour between the buildings like water finding its level. Buck Morrison's hand stopped inches from Sarah's face, as something primal in his brain recognized danger. The Apache stepped into view as silently as morning mist, but with the presence of a gathering storm. He was tall and lean, his copper skin weathered by desert winds and marked by the kind of scars that spoke of survival against impossible odds. His long black hair was pulled back and adorned with a single eagle feather that caught the harsh sunlight. He wore simple buckskin clothing and moccasins that made no sound on the hard-packed earth. But it was his eyes that stopped every man in that alley. Dark as storm clouds and just as full of warning, they surveyed the scene with the calm assessment of a predator, deciding whether these creatures were worth his attention. "Well, I'll be damned," Buck whispered, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier confidence. "Boys, we got ourselves a lost Injun." The Apache's gaze settled on Sarah, taking in her torn dress, her tear-stained face, and the desperate fear in her green eyes. For a moment, something flickered across his stoic features, recognition of pain he understood all too well. His name was Chayton, which meant falcon in his people's tongue, though these white men would never know that. He had been tracking a deer through the arroyos when he'd heard the cruel laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Chayton had learned long ago that laughter like that usually meant someone was suffering. He had lost his own family to men not unlike these, buffalo soldiers who had come in the night, claiming his people were raiding settlements. His wife, Ayana, and their young son had died in the flames of their wickiup while he was away hunting. That was 3 years ago, and he had wandered alone ever since, a ghost between two worlds that would never accept him. "You best move along, Chief," Jake Henley said, trying to inject authority into his voice, but failing. "This ain't none of your concern." And Chayton's response was to step closer, his movement fluid and controlled. In his right hand, almost casually, appeared a knife with a bone handle, worn smooth by years of use. He hadn't drawn it in any dramatic fashion. It had simply materialized, as if it were an extension of his will. "The woman," he said, his English careful and precise, carrying only the slightest accent. "She goes free." Buck Morrison had not lived this long by backing down from fights, but something about this Apache made his survival instincts scream warnings. Still, he had a reputation to maintain, and 4 men stood with him. "Like hell she does," Buck snarled, reaching for the pistol at his hip. "This is white man's business, and you got no—" The knife left Chayton's hand so quickly that Buck never saw it coming. The blade thudded into the wooden wall inches from Buck's ear, embedding itself so deeply that the handle quivered like a tuning fork. Chayton hadn't moved from his spot, but somehow another knife had appeared in his hand. His expression remained unchanged, but his message was clear. Sarah watched in amazement as the 5 men who had seemed so confident moments before now shuffled nervously like schoolboys caught stealing apples. The Apache, this stranger who owed her nothing, had shifted the entire balance of power with nothing more than his presence and a warning shot. "The next one finds flesh," Chayton said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. "Choose." The standoff stretched like a taut rope in the oppressive heat. Sweat beaded on Buck Morrison's forehead, and for the first time in years he felt genuine fear. The Apache stood motionless, yet every line of his body spoke of coiled violence ready to strike. Jake Henley, his whiskey-fueled bravado evaporating like morning dew, was the first to break. "Buck, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Buck hissed, but his eyes never left Chayton. He was calculating odds, measuring the distance to his gun against the Apache's inhuman speed. The mathematics of survival were not in his favor. Sarah remained crouched in the dust, hardly daring to breathe. She had heard stories of Apache warriors, tales of their skill in battle, their legendary ability to appear and disappear like desert spirits. But looking at this man, she saw something beyond the fearsome reputation. In his dark eyes, she glimpsed a depth of pain that mirrored her own desperate situation. Chayton took a single step forward, the movement smooth and deliberate. "The woman has done you no harm," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Your quarrel is with her debt, not her body." "You don't understand the situation here, Chief," Buck said, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This little lady came to us begging for money. Now she's got to pay what she owes one way or another." "How much?" Chayton asked simply. The question caught Buck off guard. "What?" "The debt. How much does she owe?" Buck's mind raced. Here was an opportunity to save face and maybe make some profit. $50, he said, inflating the actual amount by more than double. "Plus interest, of course." Sarah gasped. She'd only asked for $15 for her brother's medicine. The impossibility of such a sum crushed down on her like a physical weight. Chayton reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and produced a handful of silver coins, Mexican pesos, American silver dollars, and Spanish reals. The mixed currencies told a story of a man who moved between worlds, trading and surviving on the edges of civilization. He counted out coins, slowly, deliberately, the metallic clinks echoing in the alley. When he finished, he held out the exact amount Buck had demanded. $50, Chayton said. "The debt is paid. The woman goes free." Buck stared at the silver glinting in the Apache's palm. It was more money than he'd seen in months, and he could practically taste the whiskey and cards it would buy. But accepting it felt like surrender, like admitting that this savage had authority over him. "That's real generous of you, Chief," Buck said slowly, "but it don't change the fact that you're trespassing in a white man's town. Maybe we should just take that silver and teach you some manners about knowing your place." The words had barely left his mouth when Chayton moved. Not toward his knife, not toward Buck, but toward Sarah. In one fluid motion, he bent down and helped her to her feet, his touch gentle but firm, the simple act of kindness. The first she had experienced in this nightmare brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Run," he whispered to her in English, then added something in Apache that she didn't understand, but somehow felt in her bones. A blessing, a wish for safety. Sarah looked into his face and saw her own desperation reflected there, mixed with a resignation that broke her heart. This man was preparing to die for a stranger, and they both knew it. "I can't," she whispered back. "Not if it means—" "Go," he said more firmly, never taking his eyes off the 5 men who were beginning to spread out around them. "Your brother needs you alive." The mention of Tommy sent a jolt through Sarah's system. Her brother was depending on her, and this stranger was offering her the chance to save him. But the cost. "Together," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her own courage. "We leave together, or not at all." For the first time since he'd appeared, Chayton's expression shifted. The slightest smile touched the corners of his mouth, not of humor, but of respect. In this frightened young woman, he saw something he had lost 3 years ago, the courage to stand beside someone else, even in the face of death. Buck Morrison watched this exchange with growing rage. His authority was slipping away like sand through his fingers and in front of his own men. That could not stand. "Enough!" he roared, drawing his pistol. "You want to die together? I'll oblige you both." The gun cleared leather, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. The report of Buck's pistol echoed off the adobe walls like thunder, but Chayton was already moving. Years of warfare had taught him to read the subtle shifts in a man's stance that preceded violence, and he had seen death in Buck Morrison's eyes, a heartbeat, before the trigger was pulled. Chayton spun, pulling Sarah with him, and the bullet meant for his chest scored a burning line across his left shoulder instead. He didn't cry out, couldn't afford to show weakness now, but Sarah felt his grip tighten on her arm. What happened next would be talked about in Copper Creek for decades to come. Moving with the fluid grace of a desert cat, Chayton swept up his embedded knife from the wall without breaking stride. His second blade appeared in his other hand as if materialized from the air itself. Buck was fumbling to cock his single-action revolver when Chayton's first knife took him in the gun arm, just above the wrist. Buck screamed and dropped his weapon, clutching his bleeding arm. The other 4 men scattered like startled quail, their loyalty to their leader evaporating the moment real danger appeared. Jake Henley tried to run, but tripped over his own feet in his haste, sprawling face first into the dirt. The others disappeared around corners and behind buildings, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. In less than 10 seconds, the entire dynamic had reversed. Buck Morrison, the terror of Copper Creek's back streets, sat whimpering in the dust while blood seeped between his fingers. Chayton stood over him, breathing hard but controlled, his dark eyes showing no mercy. "The debt is finished," he said quietly. "If you follow the woman, if you trouble her again, I will know. And next time, I will not miss what I aim for." Buck nodded frantically, all his swagger gone. He had seen death in those storm cloud eyes, and he believed every word. Chayton picked up his first knife and cleaned both blades on his buckskin shirt before sheathing them. The silver coins he had offered still lay scattered in the dust. He gathered them up and pressed them into Sarah's trembling hands. "For your brother's medicine," he said softly. Sarah stared at the coins, then at this enigmatic man who had risked his life for a stranger. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Chayton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I had a son once. He was sick like your brother. I was away hunting when the soldiers came. I was not there to protect him, to save him." He looked back at her, and Sarah saw the depth of his pain. "I cannot save my boy, but perhaps I can save yours." The simple honesty of his words broke something loose in Sarah's chest. Here was a man who had lost everything, wandering alone in a world that showed him nothing but hostility, yet he had chosen to help when help was desperately needed. "What's your name?" she asked. "Chaitan," he said. "It means falcon in my people's tongue." Sarah McKenna," she replied, then added impulsively, "Come with me. Let me tend to your wound, at least. It's the least I can do." Chaitan shook his head. "Your people would not welcome me in their homes, and there are those who would use my presence to cause you more trouble." "Then meet me at the Old Oak by Miller's Creek," Sarah said urgently. "Tomorrow at sunset. I'll bring supplies to clean that wound properly." Before Chaitan could object, Sarah did something that surprised them both. She reached up and gently touched his uninjured shoulder, a gesture of gratitude and human connection that he hadn't felt in 3 long years. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me hope when I had none left." As Sarah hurried away toward the main street and toward the doctor's office where she could finally buy Tommy's medicine, Chaitan watched her go. For the first time since he had lost his family, he felt something other than emptiness in his chest. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. He melted back into the shadows between the buildings, invisible once again. But something had changed. The encounter had planted a seed in the wasteland of his heart, the understanding that sometimes, in helping others find their way back to the light, we take the first steps out of our own darkness. As the sun set over Copper Creek, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, both Sarah and Chaitan carried something they hadn't possessed that morning: hope. She for her brother's recovery, and he for the chance that perhaps, even in a world that seemed determined to tear people apart, connections could still be forged between 2 souls who understood what it meant to fight for something greater than themselves. The story would not end there, of course. Sarah would meet Chaitan at the Old Oak as promised, beginning a friendship that would slowly heal both their wounded hearts. She would teach him that not all white settlers were his enemies, and he would show her strength she never knew she possessed. Together, they would face the prejudices of a divided world and prove that understanding could bridge even the deepest chasms of mistrust. But that is a story for another day. For now, it was enough that when evil had circled like wolves, courage had answered, not with grand gestures or supernatural intervention, but with the simple human choice to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Sometimes, that is the most powerful magic of all.